Hello, and welcome back to Autistic After Hours. I'm your host, Ashra, and today we are talking about a very hot topic. The question is, does Tylenol cause autism? Before we get into the episode, quick reminder to follow Autistic After Hours on Instagram. I post original content over there every single week. And a quick reminder that you can watch Autistic After Hours episodes on YouTube. If you are watching me here right now, hello. If you see a laptop in front of me, that is because this episode today is very heavily influenced by research, so I will be reading off of my laptop because I want to make sure that I am as objective, as factual, and as clear as possible. This is a very important topic. There's a lot of nuance to this conversation, and it has some very real implications in real life for many people, so I want to be as clear as possible. With that being said, I'm a human. I am interpreting this through a subjective lens, and I am by no means an expert on this topic. So please hold me accountable, do your own research, and don't trust everything that every person says just because they're saying it. Please do your own research and know that I can make mistakes, even though I'm attempting to be as clear, as factual, and objective as possible. With that being said, let's get into the episode. I don't want to keep any of you on your toes, and so before I delve into any of the research, before we get into any of it, I'm going to very clearly state that the answer to the question, does Tylenol cause autism, is no. There is no solid, peer-reviewed scientific evidence showing that acetaminophen use causes autism. There is none. There is a reason, though, why there are headlines about Tylenol and autism. There are reasons why this is a very big topic in the media right now, and we're going to explore that today. Ultimately, as a summary, before we get into the details, there have been some studies that found what researchers call an association, meaning that people who reported using acetaminophen during pregnancy sometimes had slightly higher rates of children later diagnosed with autism or ADHD. But the important factor here is that these studies found an association, and an association is not the same thing as proof or causation. So in this episode, I'm going to explore what researchers have actually studied, because it's not really what you're seeing in the media in these headlines, what observational studies are, and why they have limits, and why that's a big reason for why a lot of research is being misinterpreted. I'm also going to talk about why sibling comparison studies are so important and what those have shown on this topic. I'm also going to talk about what the strongest reviews have concluded so far, and also what doctors and health organizations actually have recommended. So first, let's talk about where these headlines are actually coming from. I'm sure you've heard very influential people say things like, don't take Tylenol, Tylenol causes autism. I know there is one specific person we're all thinking about who really loves saying this without any evidence to back up their assertions. And so let's talk about where these headlines are coming from and why people are saying it. Over the past 10 or 15 years, there have been some large population studies looking at medical records or studies where they actually asked pregnant people about acetaminophen use. They noticed that children whose mothers reported using acetaminophen seemed to be diagnosed with autism or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder slightly more often. That is an association. It means that two things showed up together in the data. It does not mean that one thing caused the other thing. It just means that these two things showed up together in the data. And that is what a lot of people are misunderstanding about these studies. And that is why there are so many misinformed, misleading, inaccurate headlines. I'm going to give a quick example to further demonstrate what an association is and why it's not the same thing as a causation. So a simple example is that ice cream sales and drowning deaths both increase in the summertime. That is an association. It does not mean that ice cream causes drowning. The confounding factor that actually explains both of these things is that there's hot weather. When there is hot weather, ice cream sales go up and drowning deaths also go up. Do you think that it makes sense for me to then say ice cream leads to drowning? No. And that is what is happening in these studies. Just because these two things are showing up in the data does not mean that we should link them together. Now let's talk about one of the clearest pieces of research on this question, In 2024, a study published in the JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, looked at hundreds of thousands of births in Scandinavia. The study used a special design called a sibling controlled analysis. That means that they compared children who had the same mother, but where the mother used acetaminophen in one pregnancy and not in the other pregnancy. So this is important because it controls for genetics and family environment, which a lot of other studies don't do. What we'd expect if acetaminophen truly caused autism is we would see that higher autism rates occurred in the child exposed to acetaminophen during the pregnancy compared to their sibling who was not exposed to acetaminophen during the pregnancy. We would expect that the child exposed to acetaminophen would have higher rates of developing autism, and the child that was not exposed to acetaminophen would have less rates of developing autism. But the result that they actually found here was that that didn't happen. There was no increased risk. The link disappeared when you accounted for the family factors. So in other studies where they weren't doing the sibling control design, where they were simply looking at the observational data of did mothers who report using acetaminophen during pregnancy have autistic or ADHD kids, they found a very small association, a very small increased risk of using acetaminophen during pregnancy leading to autism or ADHD in the kid. But when they actually used the sibling-controlled analysis, that increase disappeared. The risk disappeared, meaning that when the mother used acetaminophen for one pregnancy and not the other, there was no difference between the rates of the child having autism or ADHD. That's your answer. That is a big signal that the earlier associations found in any other studies were likely explained by other factors, not by the acetaminophen use. Because again, if acetaminophen use in pregnancy did truly cause autism, then we would expect to see that there would be higher rates of autism in the child exposed to acetaminophen during pregnancy than to their sibling who was not exposed to acetaminophen, but that didn't show up in the data. There are also systematic reviews, which are studies that summarize all of the existing research. In 2022, there was an open access review that pulled together all of the available data at the time on the subject, and the conclusion was that the data was very mixed, very inconsistent, and not at all strong enough to say that there is any sort of causal effect of acetaminophen use during pregnancy leading to autism. Now we're going to talk about what observational studies are and why they have their limits. So most of the earlier studies that showed any sort of link or association were what scientists would describe as an observational study. So let's break down what that means. Observational means that researchers did not assign people to groups in a randomized control clinical trial. So basically, they didn't assign people to a control group or to a experimental group. They simply observed what people naturally did. So who took acetaminophen and who didn't, and then they tracked those outcomes. But the problem here is that you cannot perfectly control for all of the other differences between the groups. There are lots of other factors, like we were talking about before, confounding factors that may have an impact. For example, maybe one mother took Tylenol because they had a high fever or an infection or chronic pain, and maybe that underlying condition is the actual factor affecting the outcome and the development of the kid, not the medication itself. And in studies that are simply observational, you cannot control for those other confounding factors. So you cannot make a causal claim when you can't control for confounding variables. You simply can't. That's not how science works. Another big issue with these observational studies is the way that acetaminophen use is actually measured. Some of the studies rely on parents remembering years later whether they used Tylenol during pregnancy, and obviously human memories are subject to flaw. If you're asking someone to remember if they used Tylenol during their pregnancy that was 10 years ago, I mean, come on. How can you expect that to be reliable? That's why the sibling control studies should have more weight than a lot of these other observational studies that are relying on human memory, which is not super accurate. The sibling control studies also help to handle a lot of the confounding issues like genetics and family factors, while a lot of these observational studies cannot speak to those. So if we're actually looking at the concrete data that is more reliable, the sibling control study, there was no increased risk. There was no association. Now let's talk about animal studies and biological ideas. You might hear that some animal studies show possible biological effects, things like oxidative stress or hormonal changes, and while that's true in some lab work, the important part is that findings in mice or rats do not automatically apply to humans because humans are not mice and rats. So while animal studies can be useful for generating ideas and further questions for actual concrete research, you simply cannot prove risk in people by showing it in rats and mice, because we are not the same. Now let's talk about the health organizations and what they say. Right now, any major health organizations all agree that there is no conclusive evidence that acetaminophen causes autism because there is no conclusive evidence that acetaminophen use causes autism. There isn't. The World Health Organization, the United States Food and Drug Administration, and the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists all reviewed this. Their guidance is all the same. Acetaminophen is still considered one of the safest options for treating pain and fever in pregnancy when used as directed. And there's a very important reason for that. Untreated high fever in pregnancy can itself be extremely risky, so the risks of not treating a fever may be greater than the uncertain and unproven concerns about acetaminophen, because we know that high fever can be very risky and detrimental in pregnancy, while we don't know that there is any causal link between acetaminophen use and developing autism, because there is no study that shows that. So now, what are the practical takeaways? Let's summarize all of this. Number one, and most importantly, there is no proof of causation in any of these studies, and the most important study that actually controlled for confounding family factors was the Sibling control study, and that study found no risk, no association between acetaminophen use and autism. And that's the main takeaway. Number two, while there are some studies saying that associations exist, these associations weaken under stronger study designs. So when researchers actually control for genetics and family factors, any link that they found between acetaminophen use and autism disappears. And I'll say that again. When the study design strengthens, the association weakens. So there, again, is your answer. Number three, research is ongoing. Scientists are still studying this question carefully, but for right now, there is no causal link between acetaminophen use in pregnancy leading to autism. And if anyone says there is, they are either pushing their own agenda or they are misinterpreting the data. As always, all of the research and the literature used in this episode will be cited in the show notes. And again, you can fact check me, let me know if I interpreted anything incorrectly. I tried my best, and this is what I found. But the main summary here, the main important takeaway here, is that there is no causal link between autism and acetaminophen use in the research. And if you believe in science, then that is the only thing to take away from the science. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. You can tell that I'm heated and that I'm emotional about this topic because it's very frustrating to see the way people are taking this misinformation and running with it without even bothering to actually look into the research themselves. Because if you actually looked into the research yourself, you'd find what I just told you here today. As always, remember, autistic adults deserve awareness, support, community, and acceptance, and I'm so grateful that you're here, and I'll talk to you again soon. Bye.